The doors of the great hall burst open before anyone gave a signal, and every head in the room turned at once. Elena Voss felt her heart stop before she even understood why. She was standing at the altar, dressed in white, her hand still resting inside the hand of the man she had loved for 3 years. Alpha Damien Ashwood, the man who, in front of 500 guests, had just opened his mouth to speak his wedding vows. But no vows came. Instead, a woman none of them recognized walked down the center aisle, her eyes locked on Damien, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. She was tall, dressed in deep green, with hair the color of autumn leaves. The guests began to whisper. Someone gasped. Elena felt Damien's hand tighten around hers, not out of love, but out of shock. "Who is that?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising murmurs. Damien did not answer her. His eyes were fixed on the woman in green, as though a rope had been tied around his chest, and someone was slowly pulling it tight. His breathing changed. His whole body seemed to lean toward the stranger, pulled by something Elena could not see and did not understand. "Damien." Elena squeezed his hand, trying to bring him back to the moment, back to her, back to the vows they were supposed to be exchanging. "Damien, look at me." He turned to her then, and what she saw in his eyes broke something inside her chest. It was not confusion, it was not distraction, it was recognition. The kind of recognition that only happens once in a lifetime among wolves like them. Elena had heard about it in stories, had been warned about it by the elders of her pack since she was a child. The mate bond, the invisible thread that ties two souls together the moment their eyes meet, stronger than promises, stronger than plans, stronger than years of building a life side by side. "Elena," his voice cracked, "I have to tell you something." The entire hall had gone silent now. 500 pairs of eyes fixed on the altar, on the bride in white and the groom whose hand was trembling in hers. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She already knew. Somewhere deep inside, before he said a single word, she already knew what he was about to do to her. "She's my mate," Damien said, and the words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the entire room. "I didn't know until this moment. I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know." Elena stood frozen, her white dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a cruel play, rather than a wedding gown. She could hear murmurs rising around her, could feel dozens of eyes shifting between her and the stranger in green, who now stood at the base of the altar steps, watching Damien with the same helpless longing that was written across his face. "You didn't know," Elena repeated, her voice flat, disbelieving. "You are telling me, in front of everyone, on our wedding day, that you have a mate, and it is not me." "Elena, please, let me explain." "There is nothing to explain." Her voice rose now, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blade. 3 years of her life, 3 years of planning, of promises, of believing that the life she was building was solid ground beneath her feet, and in one single moment, it had all turned to sand, slipping away between her fingers before she could even close her fist around it. The woman in green stepped closer, and Elena finally saw her clearly. Celine. Someone in the crowd had whispered her name, though Elena didn't know from where. Celine did not look triumphant. She did not look like a woman who had come to steal a groom on his wedding day. She looked as stunned and as helpless as Damien did, caught in the pull of a bond neither of them had asked for. "I am sorry," Celine said softly, and somehow her quiet apology hurt more than if she had shouted in victory. "I did not know either. I only felt it the moment I walked through those doors." Elena looked between them, between the man who had promised to spend his life with her and the woman fate had chosen for him instead, and she felt something inside her chest shatter into pieces too small to ever be put back together. The pack elders in the front row exchanged uneasy glances. Someone near the back stood up as if to leave, then thought better of it and sat back down. No one knew what to do. No one had ever seen a wedding collapse in real time before their eyes. "I need everyone to understand," Damien said, turning to face the crowd now, his voice gaining the practiced authority of a pack alpha even as his personal world crumbled. "This is not something I planned. The mate bond cannot be denied. If I ignore it, it will slowly destroy me, and it will destroy this pack. You all know the old laws. You all know what happens to an alpha who denies his true mate." Elena wanted to scream. She wanted to ask him, since when did the old laws matter more than the life they had built together? Since when did tradition outweigh 3 years of shared meals, shared plans, shared nights spent talking about the future they would build? But her throat had closed, and no words would come out. All she could do was stand there in her white dress, watching her future dissolve in front of 500 witnesses. Elena. Damien turned back to her, and for a moment, something like real regret flickered across his face. I am sorry. I never meant to hurt you like this. Then don't, she said, finding her voice again, though it shook with every word. Don't do this. Send her away. Choose me. You have a choice, Damien, even if you don't want to admit it. But even as she said the words, she saw the truth in his eyes. He had already chosen. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with the same helpless certainty that governs a falling object pulled toward the earth. The bond had already decided for him, and no amount of pleading from her would change what his body and his instincts had already accepted as fact. I cannot fight it, he whispered. Please believe me. I wish I could. Elena looked around the hall one last time, at the guests who had traveled from across the region to witness her wedding, at the flowers she had chosen herself, at the golden light pouring through the tall windows onto a scene that no longer resembled a celebration at all. She thought of her parents, seated in the front row, her mother's hand pressed against her mouth in horror, her father's jaw clenched so tight it looked as though it might crack. She thought of everything she had sacrificed to be standing here today, the pack she had left behind to join the Ashwood territory, the friendships she had let fade because her life had become entirely wrapped around Damien and the future they were supposed to share. And now, in the span of a few minutes, all of it had been taken from her, not by an enemy, not by an accident, but by a woman who had simply walked through the wrong door, at the wrong time, and awakened something Damien never knew was sleeping inside him. I need air, Elena said quietly, and before anyone could stop her, before Damien could reach for her hand again, she turned and walked down the aisle, past the rows of stunned guests, past her parents, past everyone who had come to watch her begin a new chapter of her life. She walked straight through the doors of the great hall and out into the cold evening air, leaving behind the wreckage of everything she had believed in. Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange, the sun sinking low behind the mountains that surrounded the Ashwood territory. Elena stood on the stone steps of the hall, gulping in air, as though she had been drowning inside, her hands trembling at her sides. She could hear the murmur of voices behind her, could hear someone calling her name, but she did not turn back. She did not know how long she stood there before she noticed she was not alone. A man stood near the edge of the courtyard, half hidden in the shadow of a tall stone pillar, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, dressed in black, rather than the formal colors most of the guests wore. Elena recognized him immediately, and her stomach dropped for an entirely different reason. Alpha Cain Draven, ruler of the Nightfall Pack, the Ashwood family's oldest rival, a man whose name was rarely spoken in this territory, without a curse attached to it. She had heard the stories, the tension between the two packs stretching back generations, old wounds that had never fully healed. What was he doing here, at her wedding, watching her fall apart in the courtyard? You should not be here, she said, wiping quickly at her eyes, embarrassed to be seen like this by a stranger, let alone a rival alpha. I was invited, Cain said simply, his voice low and even. As a gesture of peace between our territories, I did not expect to witness something like this. Elena laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even herself. Neither did I. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of chaos continued behind the closed doors of the great hall, muffled voices rising and falling. But out here in the courtyard, the evening felt strangely still, as though the world outside the wedding hall had not yet learned what had happened inside it. I am sorry, Cain said finally, and there was nothing mocking in his tone, nothing that suggested he was enjoying his rival's humiliation. No one deserves to be treated the way you were treated in there. Elena studied him for a moment, trying to reconcile the calm, almost gentle man standing before her, with the ruthless reputation that followed his name through every territory in the region. Why do you care? Your pack and his have hated each other for decades. Because cruelty is cruelty, Cain said, regardless of which pack commits it. Elena did not know how to respond to that. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the evening air had become, how thin her wedding dress felt against the wind sweeping down from the mountains. Behind her, she heard the great doors of the hall creak open, and she knew without turning around that Damien had come looking for her. "Elena," his voice carried across the courtyard, tired and pleading. "Please, come back inside. We need to talk about this properly, not out here in front of everyone." She turned slowly, and for the first time since the ceremony collapsed, she felt something other than grief rising inside her. Anger. Cold, clean anger that steadied her shaking hands and straightened her spine. "There is nothing left to talk about, Damien," she said. "You made your choice in front of 500 people. I heard you clearly. Elena, please." He took a step toward her, glancing warily at Kane as he did, some old instinct of rivalry flaring even in the middle of his own personal disaster. "This does not have to be the end of everything. We can still find a way to make this work, all three of us, if you would just—" "If I would just what?" Elena's voice cracked with disbelief. "Share you? Is that what you are asking me to do?" Damien did not answer, and his silence was answer enough. Elena felt the last thread of hope she had been quietly holding on to snap completely. She looked at him one final time, this man she had loved for 3 years, and she felt nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness where her love for him used to live. "Goodbye, Damien," she said, and the words felt lighter than she expected, as though speaking them out loud released something heavy from her chest. She turned to walk away, though she had no destination in mind, nowhere to go, no plan for what came next. But before she could take more than a few steps, Kane's voice stopped her. "Come with me," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it, not out of pity, out of respect, for a woman who deserves far better than what happened to her tonight. Elena turned back to look at him, startled by the offer, by the strange calm certainty in his voice. Behind her, Damien's face twisted with something between disbelief and anger, his rival's presence suddenly feeling far more threatening than it had a moment ago. "Elena, do not listen to him," Damien said sharply. "You do not know what kind of man he is." "And you do not know what kind of woman I am about to become," Elena replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. She looked at Kane, weighing his offer, weighing the strange twist her evening had taken, weighing the fact that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Give me a moment," she said to him, and then she turned to face Damien one last time, her chin lifted, her eyes dry. "I hope you and Celine find whatever it is the bond has decided you deserve," she said, "but you no longer have any claim over what happens to me next." She did not wait for his response. She walked toward Kane, toward the unknown, toward a future that had, only an hour ago, seemed impossible to imagine. Behind her, the wedding hall stood silent, its golden light spilling out onto the stone courtyard, illuminating a scene that no one inside would forget for years to come. Ahead of her, the mountains rose dark against the orange sky, and somewhere beyond them lay nightfall territory, a place she had never once imagined she would call home. But tonight, everything she had once believed certain had crumbled in an instant. And perhaps, she thought as she walked beside a man she barely knew, that was not entirely a tragedy. Perhaps it was simply the beginning of something else entirely, something she had not yet found the courage to imagine. Kane led her toward a black car parked at the edge of the courtyard, away from the crowd of guests who had begun spilling out through the main doors, drawn by curiosity and the need for fresh air after witnessing something none of them had words for. Elena kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the hall, refusing to give Damien the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. "You do not have to do this," Kane said quietly as they walked. "If you want to stay, if you want to fight for whatever is left there, I will not think less of you for it." "There is nothing left to fight for," Elena said. He made that clear enough. They reached the car, and Kane opened the passenger door for her, an old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely out of place, given everything that had just happened. Elena paused before getting in, glancing back one final time at the golden light spilling from the hall's windows, at the shapes of guests moving inside, whispering, speculating, already turning tonight's disaster into tomorrow's gossip. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, turning to face Kane directly. "You do not know me. We have never spoken more than a few polite words at pack gatherings. Why would you offer to help me now, tonight, when it could damage whatever fragile peace exists between our territories? Kane considered the question for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Because I watched a man throw away something valuable without a second thought, and I could not stand by and let that woman believe she deserved to be thrown away. Elena studied his face, searching for some hidden motive, some angle she was missing. She had grown up hearing stories about the Nightfall Pack and its alpha, stories painted in shades of danger and ruthlessness. But the man standing before her now, offering his hand to help her into his car, did not match those stories at all. I am not asking you to trust me completely, Kane added, as though reading the doubt in her eyes. I am only asking you to let me help you leave a place that just humiliated you in front of everyone you know. What you do after that is entirely your choice. Elena took a breath, feeling the cold evening air fill her lungs, feeling the last remnants of the wedding, the dress, the vows, the years of planning, settle heavily inside her chest before she finally let them go. She climbed into the car. As Kane started the engine, she caught one last glimpse of the hall through the window, of Damien standing on the steps with Celine beside him, both of them watching the car pull away. She thought she saw something like regret on Damien's face, but she did not care anymore whether it was real or imagined. The car turned onto the road leading away from Ashwood territory, and Elena Voss left behind the only life she had known for the past 3 years, riding into the darkness beside a man the world called her enemy. Neither of them spoke for several minutes as the car wound its way down the mountain road, the lights of Ashwood territory shrinking behind them in the rearview mirror. Elena stared out the window, watching the trees blur past in the darkness, her mind replaying the ceremony over and over, searching for some sign she had missed, some warning that might have prepared her for what happened. You are allowed to grieve this, Kane said eventually, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. What happened to you tonight was real, and it hurt you. Pretending otherwise will not make the pain disappear faster. Elena turned to look at him, surprised again by the quiet understanding in his voice. Everyone always tells me to be strong. My mother, my pack elders, even Damien, right before he humiliated me in front of everyone, no one has ever told me it was allowed to hurt. Strength is not the absence of pain, Kane said. It is what you choose to do after the pain arrives. She did not respond, but she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some tight knot of tension she had been holding since the moment those doors burst open and Celine walked down the aisle. She let herself lean her head against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour. Where are we going? She asked after a while, her voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried in the courtyard. Nightfall territory, Kane said. You will have your own space there, for as long as you need it. No obligations, no expectations. Just somewhere safe to rebuild, if that is what you decide you want. Elena opened her eyes and studied his profile in the dim light of the dashboard, the sharp line of his jaw, the steady focus in his eyes as he navigated the winding mountain road. She thought about how strange it was that the man she had been taught to fear her entire life was the one offering her the first real kindness she had received all evening. Thank you, she said quietly, and she meant it more deeply than the simple words could express. Kane nodded once, his eyes still on the road, and said nothing more. The car continued on through the darkness, carrying Elena away from the wreckage of her old life and toward a future neither of them could yet fully imagine, while behind them, in the golden light of the Ashwood Hall, Damien Ashwood stood frozen on the steps, watching the taillights disappear into the night, and finally beginning to understand the true weight of what he had just lost. The gates of Nightfall territory rose out of the darkness, like something from an old legend, tall iron structures set into a stone wall that stretched as far as Elena could see in either direction. Guards nodded as the car passed through, their eyes flicking briefly to Elena before returning to their posts, trained enough not to show open surprise at the sight of their alpha bringing home a stranger from Ashwood lands. Elena sat up straighter as the car wound its way up a long drive toward a manor house built from dark stone, its windows glowing warm with lamplight against the night sky. It was nothing like the bright, open architecture of the Ashwood estate. Nightfall's manor felt older, heavier, built to withstand centuries rather than to impress guests at a single gathering. This is your home, Elena murmured, more to herself than to Kane. For now, he said. It has been in my family for 6 generations. The car stopped in front of the main entrance, and Kane came around to open her door, before she could reach for the handle herself. Elena stepped out onto the gravel drive, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold mountain air, suddenly aware of how out of place her white wedding dress looked against the dark stone of the manor and the black uniforms of the guards stationed near the entrance. "I imagine you would like to change out of that dress," Kane said, following her gaze down to the gown she still wore, the one meant for an entirely different life than the one she now found herself walking into. "More than anything," Elena admitted, a tired laugh escaping her despite everything. Inside, the manor was just as imposing as its exterior suggested, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb the light from the chandeliers rather than reflect it. A woman appeared almost immediately, older, with silver streaked through her dark hair, and sharp, assessing eyes that studied Elena from head to toe, without any attempt to hide her curiosity. "Margaret, this is Elena," Kane said. "She will be staying with us. Please see that she has everything she needs, starting with something more comfortable to wear." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she said nothing about the obvious oddity of the situation, only nodding and gesturing for Elena to follow her up a wide staircase toward the guest wing of the manor. Elena glanced back once at Kane, who remained standing near the entrance, watching her go with an expression she still could not quite decipher. "You will find everything you need in your room," Margaret said as they walked, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Towels, clothing, anything else you require, simply ring for me." "Thank you," Elena said, still trying to absorb the strangeness of the evening, the way her entire world had turned upside down in the space of a few hours. "I imagine this is unusual for you. Guests do not typically arrive like this." Margaret paused at the door to a large guest room, her expression softening slightly. "Alpha Draven has never brought a guest home in the middle of the night before, if that is what you are asking. But I have worked in this house for 30 years, and I have learned not to question his judgment." She left Elena alone in the room, and for the first time since the wedding hall doors had burst open, Elena found herself completely alone with her thoughts. She sat down on the edge of the large bed, still dressed in white, and finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely, silent sobs shaking her shoulders, as the full weight of the evening crashed over her at once. She cried for the wedding that never happened, for the 3 years she had invested in a future that had dissolved in an instant, for the humiliation of standing at that altar while 500 people watched her world collapse. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she sat in the quiet stillness of the unfamiliar room, feeling strangely hollow but also, somewhere beneath the grief, faintly free. Eventually, she rose and found the clothing Margaret had left for her, simple and comfortable, nothing like the elaborate gown she had worn all evening. She changed slowly, folding the wedding dress with careful, deliberate movements, though she was not sure why she bothered preserving something that represented such pain. Perhaps some part of her still could not quite let go of the life it symbolized, even as she stepped away from it entirely. A soft knock came at her door some time later, and when she opened it, she found Kane standing in the hallway, no longer wearing the formal clothes he had worn at the wedding, dressed instead in simple dark clothing that made him look less like a rival alpha and more like an ordinary man checking on a guest. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in," he said, "and to ask if you would like something to eat. I imagine you did not get the chance to enjoy much of your own wedding feast." Despite everything, Elena felt a small, surprised laugh escape her at the observation. "No, I did not." She followed him down to a smaller dining room, cozier than she expected, given the imposing nature of the rest of the manor, where a simple meal had been laid out. They ate mostly in silence at first, though it was not an uncomfortable silence, more like two people who understood there was no need to fill every moment with conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said eventually, setting down her fork. "Of course. Why did you really come to the wedding tonight? You said it was a gesture of peace, but I find that hard to believe given everything I have heard about the history between your pack and Damien's." Kane leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he seemed to bring to everything he said. "The old conflicts between our packs have cost both sides far more than either side has ever gained. I have spent the last 2 years trying to find ways to ease that tension, quietly, without drawing attention to it. Attending the wedding was meant to be a small step in that direction." And instead you ended up leaving with the bride, Elena said, a faint, dry humor creeping into her tone despite the heaviness of the day. An outcome I certainly did not anticipate, Kane admitted, and for the first time that evening, Elena saw something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile cross his face. They talked for a while longer, about small, inconsequential things at first, the history of the manor, the mountains surrounding Nightfall territory, anything that allowed Elena to keep her mind away from the wreckage of the wedding for a few precious minutes. As the evening wore on, exhaustion finally began to overtake her, and Kane walked her back to her room, pausing at the door. "You do not owe me anything," he said, before she could speak. "Not gratitude, not explanations, not even your trust yet. Take whatever time you need to figure out what comes next." Elena studied him for a long moment, this stranger who had somehow become the only steady thing in a night that had otherwise fallen apart completely around her. "Thank you, Kane, for tonight, and for not asking anything of me in return." He nodded once and turned to leave, and Elena closed the door behind her, finally alone in the quiet of the guest room. She lay down on the unfamiliar bed, staring up at the dark wooden ceiling, and for the first time all evening, she allowed herself to wonder, cautiously, what her life might look like, now that the path she had planned for herself no longer existed. Somewhere far below her window, she could hear the faint sounds of the manor settling for the night, and beyond the walls of Nightfall territory, she knew that back in Ashwood Lands, Damien was beginning his new life, with a woman fate had chosen for him instead of her. But here, in this strange, dark manor surrounded by mountains, Elena Voss closed her eyes and, despite everything, finally allowed herself to fall into a deep and dreamless sleep. Morning came slowly over Nightfall territory, gray light filtering through heavy curtains that Elena had forgotten to close the night before. She woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, her body still expecting the familiar walls of her old room back in Ashwood Lands. Then the memory of the previous night crashed over her all at once, and she lay still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality of her new circumstances settle into her bones. She dressed in the clothes Margaret had left for her, and made her way downstairs, uncertain of the manor's routines, uncertain of her place within them. The halls felt different in daylight, less imposing, and more simply old, filled with portraits of Draven ancestors, whose sharp eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. She found the dining room eventually, drawn by the smell of fresh bread, and stopped short in the doorway when she saw it was already occupied. 3 wolves sat at the long table, none of them Kane. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the practical dark clothing common among Nightfall pack members, their conversation cutting off abruptly the moment they noticed her standing there. The woman, sharp-featured with cropped dark hair, studied Elena with open suspicion. "You must be the Ashwood bride," she said, and there was no warmth in the observation, only cold curiosity, edged with something closer to hostility. "Elena," she offered, stepping into the room, despite the tension radiating from the table. "Elena Voss." "Nadia," the woman said, not bothering to introduce the 2 men beside her. "I imagine you are wondering why our Alpha brought an Ashwood woman into our territory the same night her own wedding fell apart." Elena felt her spine stiffen, old instincts of self-preservation rising to meet the challenge in Nadia's voice. "I imagine I am wondering the same thing you are." One of the men, younger, with an easy smile that did not quite match the tension in the room, spoke up before Nadia could respond. "Do not mind her. Nadia distrusts anyone connected to Ashwood on principle. My name is Theo. It is good to meet you, even under strange circumstances." "Strange circumstances," Elena repeated, a bitter edge creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "That is one way to describe it." Nadia leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Our packs have fought over territory boundaries for 3 generations. Ashwood wolves have taken land, taken resources, taken lives in disputes that never should have escalated as far as they did. And now our Alpha brings one of them into our home, like she is an honored guest." "I did not choose to be caught in the middle of a rivalry between your packs," Elena said, her voice steady despite the anger rising inside her. "I was humiliated in front of 500 people by a man I loved for 3 years. Your Alpha offered me a place to go when I had nowhere else. If that offends you, perhaps you should direct your frustration toward him rather than toward me." A tense silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of Theo shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Nadia's eyes narrowed slightly, something shifting in her expression that might have been grudging respect, though it was difficult to tell beneath the wariness that remained. She has Spirit, the third wolf, an older man who had not yet spoken, observed quietly. Perhaps that counts for something. Before the conversation could continue further, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Kane appeared in the doorway, his eyes immediately finding Elena and taking in the tense atmosphere of the room in a single glance. I see you have met some of my pack members. We were just becoming acquainted, Elena said carefully, unwilling to stir further conflict by recounting the exchange in detail. Kane's gaze moved to Nadia, something silent passing between them, an entire conversation communicated in the space of a look. Whatever he conveyed, Nadia's posture relaxed slightly, though her expression remained guarded. Elena will be staying with us, Kane said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a pack alpha addressing his people. She is a guest, and she will be treated as one. I trust that will not be a problem for anyone in this pack. Of course not, Alpha, Theo said quickly, while Nadia simply nodded once, her eyes still fixed on Elena, with an expression that suggested the conversation between them was far from finished, merely postponed. Kane gestured for Elena to join him at a smaller table near the window, away from the others, and she followed gratefully, glad for the reprieve from the tension that had filled the room moments before. As they sat, she could still feel Nadia's eyes on her back, sharp and assessing. I apologize for that, Kane said quietly, once they were settled. Nadia lost her brother in a border dispute with Ashwood wolves several years ago. Her distrust runs deep, and it will take more than my word to soften it. I understand, Elena said, and she did, in a strange way. She had spent the last several years immersed in Ashwood pack life, hearing whispered stories about nightfall aggression, about border raids and territory disputes framed always in a way that painted her own pack as the victim, the wronged party defending itself against a ruthless neighbor. Now, sitting in the heart of that supposedly ruthless territory, she was beginning to understand that the truth of the conflict was far more complicated than the simple narrative she had been raised on. It will take time, Kane said. For the pack to trust you, and perhaps for you to trust us in return. I do not expect either to happen overnight. Elena studied him across the table, this man who spoke with such measured calm, even as tension simmered around him from every direction. You seem very certain that I will stay long enough for any of that trust to build. Something flickered across Kane's face, quickly hidden. I am not certain of anything. I only know that you are welcome here, for as long as you choose to remain. Over the following days, Elena settled slowly into a rhythm within the manor, though the wariness of the pack around her did not fade quickly. She spent mornings walking the grounds, learning the layout of the territory, the way the mountains rose sharply behind the manor, and the forests stretched dark and dense toward the valley below. She avoided the common areas when she could, uncertain of her welcome, though she began to notice small gestures of kindness from unexpected sources. Margaret left extra blankets in her room without being asked, noticing that Elena had complained of the cold mountain nights. Theo made a point of greeting her warmly whenever their paths crossed, his easy friendliness a welcome contrast to the guarded suspicion she encountered from many others. Even Nadia, though her distrust remained evident, began nodding curtly in acknowledgement, rather than glaring outright whenever they passed each other in the halls. It was Kane, however, who remained the steadiest presence throughout those first difficult days, checking on her each evening, sharing quiet meals with her when his duties as alpha allowed, never pressing her for more than she was willing to give. Elena found herself, somewhat to her surprise, looking forward to those evenings, the easy conversations that gradually stretched longer as the days passed, touching on subjects far beyond the wreckage of her wedding. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, Elena found herself standing on a balcony, overlooking the dark expanse of forest beyond the manor grounds, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the mountains. She heard footsteps behind her, and did not need to turn to know it was Kane. You seem lost in thought, he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. I keep thinking about what my life would look like right now, if that woman had never walked through those doors, Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. I would be starting my first week as Damien's wife, learning to run his household, planning for the future we had talked about for years. Do you wish that had happened instead? Kane asked, his voice carefully neutral, though something in his tone suggested the answer mattered to him more than he wanted to reveal. Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind, rather than offering the easy answer that might have felt expected. I do not know anymore. I think, if I am honest, I have been asking myself the wrong question. I keep wondering what my life would look like if that night had gone differently, but perhaps I should be asking what kind of life I actually want to build now, regardless of what happened before. Kane turned to look at her fully then, something warm and genuine in his expression that had nothing to do with rivalry or politics or the careful distance he had maintained since bringing her to his territory. That sounds like the beginning of real strength, Elena. Not the kind people demand from you, but the kind you choose for yourself. She held his gaze for a long moment, feeling something shift quietly inside her chest, something she was not yet ready to name but could no longer ignore entirely. The forest below them settled into darkness, and the first stars began to appear in the clearing sky, and for the first time since the wedding hall doors had burst open and shattered everything she believed certain about her future, Elena Voss felt something that resembled hope beginning to take root in the wreckage of her old life. Word of Elena's departure from Ashwood territory spread quickly through the neighboring packs, carried by traveling merchants and messengers who thrived on stories of scandal among the ruling families. Within days, the tale had transformed from a private humiliation into a source of gossip across the entire region, whispered in marketplaces, and repeated at gatherings far beyond the borders of either territory involved. Back in Ashwood lands, Damien found himself facing a different kind of reckoning entirely. His union with Celine, sealed hastily in the days following the collapsed wedding, had done little to settle the unrest rippling through his pack. Members who had grown fond of Elena during her years among them made their disapproval known in subtle but unmistakable ways: quiet withdrawals of warmth, hesitant support in pack meetings, a general coolness that Damien could feel settling over his territory like a persistent fog. "The pack will adjust," Celine said one evening, finding Damien standing alone on the balcony of his study, staring out at the mountains in the direction of Nightfall territory, though he would not have admitted that was what he was looking toward. "These things take time." "I know," Damien said, though his voice carried little conviction. He turned to look at his new wife, this woman fate had chosen for him, and felt a strange hollowness, where he had expected the mate bond to bring overwhelming certainty and peace. The bond was there, undeniable in its physical pull, but it felt oddly thin, stretched over a foundation that had never been properly built. "You are thinking about her," Celine said quietly, and it was not a question. Damien did not deny it. "I keep wondering if I made the right choice. Not about you, about how I handled everything. I could have found a better way to tell her. I could have spared her that humiliation." "The old laws do not leave much room for gentleness," Celine said, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of the difficult reality both of them now had to navigate. "But that does not mean you are free from responsibility for how you delivered the truth." Damien said nothing, turning back to face the mountains, and Celine, sensing that he needed the silence more than any further conversation, left him alone with his thoughts. The weeks that followed, reports continued to filter into Ashwood territory about Elena's new life among the Nightfall pack, carried by traders and travelers who had no idea how closely Damien listened to every fragment of news that reached him. She had been seen walking the grounds of the Nightfall Manor. She had been present at a pack gathering, standing near Alpha Draven, engaged in conversation that had apparently drawn more than a few curious glances from those in attendance. Each piece of news landed heavier than the last, and Damien found himself increasingly consumed by a restlessness he could not fully explain, even to himself. "You should let it go," his father, the retired Ashwood Alpha, told him bluntly one afternoon, finding his son once again staring toward the mountains, with an expression that had become distressingly familiar in recent weeks. "She is no longer your concern. You have a mate now, a pack that needs stability, and an alliance that could still be salvaged if you focus your attention where it belongs." "I know where my attention should be," Damien said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Do you?" his father pressed. "Because from where I stand, it looks very much like you are watching the road toward Nightfall territory more closely than you are watching your own household." Damien did not respond, unwilling to voice the uncomfortable truth taking root inside him. that despite the undeniable pull of the mate bond connecting him to Celine, something about the way he had lost Elena continued to gnaw at him in ways that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. It was not simply guilt, though guilt certainly played its part. It was something closer to disbelief, a stubborn refusal to accept that the life he had planned so carefully could have unraveled so completely in a single evening. Meanwhile, within Nightfall territory, Elena remained largely unaware of the turmoil brewing within her former pack, focused instead on the slow, careful work of rebuilding a sense of self that had been shattered on the steps of that altar. She had begun helping Margaret with small tasks around the manor, partly out of a desire to feel useful, and partly because the routine gave her mind something to focus on other than the wreckage of her old life. "You do not need to work for your place here," Margaret told her one afternoon, watching Elena fold linens with a precision that suggested she was concentrating far more intently than the task actually required. "The Alpha has made it clear you are a guest, not staff." "I know," Elena said, "but I think I need to feel useful right now. Sitting idle gives my mind too much room to wander back to places I would rather not revisit." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something softening in her sharp features. "That is understandable. Grief has a way of finding you in quiet moments if you let it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices drifting up from the courtyard below, and both women moved toward the window to see what had caused the commotion. Elena's stomach dropped when she recognized the source of the disturbance immediately, a small delegation of Ashwood wolves standing at the gates, led by a figure she would have recognized anywhere, even from this distance. Damien had come. "He has no right to be here," Margaret said sharply, already moving toward the door, but Elena caught her arm before she could leave the room. "Wait," Elena said, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. "Let me see what he wants first." She made her way down to the courtyard, her steps quickening, despite her attempt to remain composed, and arrived, just as Kane emerged from the manor, to meet the unexpected delegation at the gates. Nadia and several other pack members had gathered nearby, tension radiating from the assembled group as old hostilities threatened to reignite in an instant. "Damien," Kane said, his voice carrying the cool authority of an alpha, addressing an uninvited guest on his own territory. "This is unexpected." "I need to speak with Elena," Damien said, his eyes scanning the courtyard until they landed on her, standing near the manor entrance, still slightly breathless from her hurried descent down the stairs. "Alone, if that is possible." "That depends entirely on whether she wishes to speak with you," Kane said, not moving from his position between Damien and the manor, a silent barrier that spoke louder than any direct threat could have. Elena stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, though she kept her voice steady when she spoke. "What could you possibly need to say to me now, Damien, that you did not already make clear at our wedding?" Damien's expression shifted, something desperate and uncertain crossing his features that Elena had never seen from him during their years together. "I need you to know that this was not what I wanted. Any of it. The way it happened, the humiliation, all of it. I have thought of little else since that night." "And what exactly did you want, Damien?" Elena asked, her voice sharp with an anger she had been slowly reclaiming since the night she left Ashwood territory behind. "For me to simply accept sharing you with a stranger? For me to smile and nod while you built a life with her instead of me?" "No," Damien said quickly. "I do not know. I only know that watching you walk away that night broke something in me I did not expect, and I have not been able to stop thinking about whether I made the wrong choice." The courtyard fell silent, tension crackling in the air between the two rival groups gathered there. Elena felt the weight of every eye upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to a confession that, only weeks ago, might have shattered her completely all over again. But standing here now, surrounded by a pack that had slowly begun to feel less like enemy territory and more like an unexpected refuge, she found that Damien's words no longer held the power over her that they once might have. "You cannot unmake the choice you already made," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly across the courtyard. "The bond chose Celine for you, and you chose to honor that bond in front of everyone I know. I have accepted that. I need you to accept it as well, and to leave me the peace I am finally beginning to find here." Damien's face crumpled slightly, the confident authority he usually carried faltering for just a moment. "Elena, please." "She has given you her answer," Kane said firmly, stepping forward slightly, his presence unmistakably protective now. I think it is time for you to return to your own territory, Damien, and to the life you chose for yourself. For a long, tense moment, it seemed as though Damien might argue further, his jaw tightening with the effort of holding back whatever else he wished to say. But eventually, he nodded once, a stiff, reluctant gesture, and turned back toward his waiting delegation, without another word to Elena. As the Ashwood group departed through the gates, disappearing back down the mountain road, Elena felt the tension slowly drain from her shoulders, replaced by a strange, unexpected clarity. "Are you all right?" Kane asked quietly, once the gates had closed and the courtyard had begun to empty of curious onlookers. "I think so," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "For the first time since that night, I think I actually am." In the weeks following Damien's unexpected visit, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift in the dynamic between Elena and Kane. Their evening conversations, once careful and measured, grew easier, longer, filled increasingly with laughter that surprised Elena each time it escaped her, as though her body had forgotten it was still capable of joy after everything that happened. She found herself looking forward to the small moments they shared throughout each day, brief exchanges in the hallway that left her smiling long after Kane had walked away, the way he always seemed to notice when something troubled her even before she said a word about it. She told herself these feelings were simply gratitude, simply the natural warmth that grows between two people thrown together by circumstance. But late at night, lying awake in the quiet of her room, she found it increasingly difficult to believe her own explanations. "You have been staring at that same page for 20 minutes, Kane observed one evening, finding Elena curled in a chair near the fireplace in the Manor's library, a book open in her lap that she had not actually read a single word of. Elena startled slightly, closing the book with more force than necessary. "I suppose my mind has been elsewhere. Care to share where it has wandered?" Kane asked, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks. Elena hesitated, uncertain how much of the truth she was willing to voice. "Honestly, I have been thinking about how strange it is that I feel more at peace here, in enemy territory, surrounded by people who distrusted me only weeks ago, than I ever felt during 3 years with Damien." "Perhaps that tells you something important," Kane said quietly. "Perhaps," Elena agreed, meeting his eyes across the small distance between their chairs, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, and Elena felt something shift in the air between them. A charge she had been carefully ignoring for weeks, finally becoming impossible to deny. It happened gradually, over the following days, small moments accumulating into something larger neither of them had quite intended. A hand lingering slightly longer than necessary during a casual touch, a glance held a beat too long across a crowded room, the easy comfort of standing close together while watching the sunset from the balcony, neither of them quite ready to step away first. Then, one evening, while walking together through the gardens behind the manor, Elena felt something that stole the breath from her lungs entirely, a pull deep in her chest, unlike anything she had ever experienced before, not even during her years with Damien. She stopped walking abruptly, her hand flying to her chest, as though she could physically feel whatever had just shifted inside her. "Elena?" Kane's voice carried immediate concern, and he moved quickly to her side. "What is wrong?" "I feel," Elena struggled to find words for the sensation coursing through her, a warmth spreading outward from her chest, an undeniable sense of rightness that settled over her like nothing she had experienced before. "I think I feel something. Something I have only heard described but never actually felt myself." Understanding dawned slowly across Kane's face, his eyes widening slightly as he too seemed to register a change he had perhaps been sensing building for some time without fully acknowledging it. "The bond." Elena nodded, still trying to process the enormity of what was happening. "I did not expect this. Not after everything with Damien, not after finally accepting that mate bonds could shatter everything I believed certain about my future." "I have felt something building between us for weeks," Kane admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual controlled authority. "I told myself it was simply the natural closeness that develops between two people sharing space, sharing conversations. I did not want to name it as anything more, Not while you were still healing from everything Damien put you through. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that this revelation troubled him rather than moved him. And now? Now that we cannot pretend it is simply friendship anymore? Kane reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and gently took her hand in his. Now I find myself hoping, perhaps selfishly, that you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling in this moment. Elena did not pull away. Instead, she found herself stepping closer, drawn by the same undeniable pull that had stopped her mid-stride only minutes before. I think I do. I think I have for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself. They stood together in the quiet garden, the last light of evening fading around them, the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment settling comfortably rather than painfully between them for the first time. Elena thought of the wedding hall, of the humiliation she had suffered there, of the long road that had led her from that altar to this garden, and felt, for the first time since that terrible night, genuinely grateful for the path her life had taken, rather than mourning the one that had been stolen from her. This changes things, Elena said eventually, though there was no fear in her voice, only quiet wonder. Between our packs, between everyone who still remembers the history that separates Ashwood and Nightfall. It does, Kane agreed. But I find myself far less concerned with old rivalries than I am with the possibility of what might grow between us, if you are willing to explore it. Elena smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had allowed herself since that terrible night at the altar, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had been missing for far longer than she had realized. I am willing, she said, more willing than I ever expected to be, given everything that brought me here. News of the developing bond between Elena and Kane spread through Nightfall territory within days, met with a mixture of reactions, ranging from cautious acceptance to lingering suspicion. Nadia, in particular, remained visibly skeptical, though even she could not deny the genuine change that seemed to have settled over her Alpha in recent weeks, a lightness that had been notably absent before Elena's arrival. I still do not fully trust her, Nadia admitted to Theo one afternoon, watching from a distance as Elena and Kane walked together through the training grounds, deep in conversation that occasionally dissolved into shared laughter. But I cannot deny that something has changed in him since she came here. He seems more himself than he has in years. Perhaps that is worth something, Theo said mildly, and Nadia, after a long moment of consideration, found she could not entirely disagree. Word travels fast among wolf packs, faster still when the news carries the weight of scandal wrapped inside political consequence. It took less than 2 weeks for whispers of the bond forming between Elena and Kane to reach Ashwood territory, carried first through cautious rumor, and then confirmed by a trader who had witnessed the couple walking together through a border town, close enough that even a stranger could sense the connection between them. Damien received the news while sitting in his study, reviewing reports on the pack's autumn harvest, and felt something cold settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with the numbers in front of him. He set down the papers slowly, his hands unsteady, in a way that surprised him. You should not let it affect you like this, Celine said gently, finding him still frozen in the same position nearly an hour later. Their bond, though genuine, allowed her to sense his distress clearly enough, even without words. She has moved on. Is that not what you told her to do, that night at the wedding? I know what I told her, Damien said, his voice tight with an emotion he could not fully name. I did not expect her to actually move on so completely, and certainly not with him. Celine studied her husband carefully, something thoughtful and slightly sad crossing her expression. You are not upset that she found happiness, Damien. You are upset that she found it with someone who is not you. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy, and Damien did not immediately deny it. He rose from his desk and moved to the window, staring out at the mountains, though he no longer needed to search the horizon for signs of Nightfall territory. He knew exactly where it lay now, knew exactly what was happening there, and the knowledge sat like a stone in his chest. I made a mistake, he said finally, the admission costing him more than he expected. Not choosing you. The bond gave me no real choice in that matter. But the way I handled everything that followed, I should have found a gentler way to release her from our engagement, some way that did not leave her humiliated in front of everyone we knew. That is true, Celine said, her honesty as gentle as it was unflinching. But you cannot undo that now, Damien. All you can do is decide how you move forward, whether you allow this regret to consume you, or whether you finally accept the life that has actually been given to you. Damien did not answer immediately, his jaw tight with the effort of processing emotions he had been suppressing for weeks. Deep down, he knew Celine was right, knew that continuing to dwell on Elena served no one, least of all himself. But knowing something intellectually, and feeling it in his bones, were entirely different matters. And the jealousy curling through his chest, at the thought of Elena finding genuine happiness with his oldest rival, refused to loosen its grip so easily. In the days that followed, Damien found himself increasingly distracted from his duties as Alpha, his attention repeatedly drawn back to reports of the growing bond in Nightfall territory, each piece of news landing heavier than the last. He told himself he simply wanted to ensure Elena's well-being, that his concern was rooted in genuine care rather than possessive jealousy, but even he found the explanation increasingly difficult to believe. "You need to let this go," his father told him bluntly, during one of their regular meetings, having noticed his son's distraction growing more pronounced with each passing week. "This obsession with what Elena is doing, who she is with, it serves no purpose, except to poison the life you have actually built here." "I am not obsessed," Damien said, though the denial felt hollow even to his own ears. "Then explain why you have asked 3 different traders this month alone about news from Nightfall territory," his father countered, his tone sharp with frustration. "Explain why your wife, the woman fate itself chose as your mate, has started sleeping in a separate wing of this house, because you spend your nights pacing rather than resting beside her." Damien had no adequate response to offer. The truth, uncomfortable as it was, had become increasingly difficult to deny, even to himself. Somewhere in the weeks since that disastrous wedding, his regret over how he had handled Elena's dismissal had curdled into something darker, something that felt uncomfortably close to obsession, though he struggled to name it honestly even in the privacy of his own thoughts. It was Celine, ultimately, who forced the confrontation neither of them had been willing to have directly. She found him late one evening, sitting alone in his study once again, staring at nothing in particular, and closed the door behind her with a finality that suggested this conversation would not be easily avoided. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, standing before his desk with quiet dignity. "Do you regret choosing the bond with me?" "No," Damien said immediately, and to his relief, he found the answer came without hesitation. "I do not regret you, Celine. I care for you, and I am grateful for what we share, even if the bond formed under circumstances neither of us chose." "Then why does it feel like half of you is still standing in that garden with her, waiting for a version of the story where you chose differently?" Damien had no immediate answer, and the silence that followed told Celine everything she needed to know regardless. "I think," she said slowly, "that you need to see for yourself that Elena has truly moved forward, rather than continuing to torment yourself with rumors and speculation from a distance. Perhaps then you will finally be able to release whatever it is you are still holding on to." Damien looked up at his wife, seeing in her expression not anger or jealousy, but a genuine, if pained, understanding of the complicated tangle of emotions he had been wrestling with alone for weeks. "You would allow that? For me to travel to Nightfall territory, to see her again? I would rather you face this directly than continue letting it quietly destroy the life we are supposed to be building together," Celine said. "But Damien, I need you to understand something clearly before you go. Whatever you find there, whatever conclusion you reach, you need to come back ready to fully commit to the life we share, or not come back to me at all." Damien nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her ultimatum, the fairness of it despite the pain it carried. He had already cost one woman her dignity through his indecision. He would not allow himself to do the same to Celine, regardless of what awaited him when he finally confronted the truth of what Elena had found in Nightfall territory. Damien arrived at the border of Nightfall territory on a gray morning, the mountains shrouded in mist that seemed to mirror the uncertainty churning inside him. He came alone this time, without the delegation that had accompanied him during his previous visit, wanting this confrontation to carry none of the political weight that had colored their last exchange. The guards at the gate recognized him immediately, tension rippling through their posture as they moved to intercept him before he could proceed further onto Nightfall land. "Alpha Ashwood," one of them said carefully, "your presence here was not announced." "I need to speak with Kane," Damien said, keeping his voice level despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. This is not a political visit. I am not here to challenge anything or anyone. I simply need to see something for myself. Word was sent ahead, and within minutes, Kane appeared at the gate himself, his expression guarded, but not immediately hostile. Behind him, at a distance, Damien caught sight of Elena, drawn by the commotion, her steps slowing as she recognized who had arrived at the border. "This is unexpected," Kane said, echoing the same words he had used during Damien's previous visit, though his tone carried less open wariness this time. "What brings you back to our territory, Damien?" "The truth," Damien said simply. "I need to see the truth of what exists between you and Elena, rather than continuing to torment myself with rumors carried by traders and travelers." Kane studied him for a long moment, something calculating in his gaze as he weighed the sincerity behind Damien's words. Eventually, he stepped aside, gesturing for Damien to enter the territory. "Then come and see for yourself. I have nothing to hide from you." They walked together toward where Elena stood waiting, her posture tense but composed, and Damien felt the weight of every step carrying him closer to a truth he had both dreaded and desperately needed to confront. When he finally stood before her, he was struck immediately by the change in her demeanor, a settled confidence that had been noticeably absent during the difficult weeks following their broken wedding. "Elena," he said, and found himself momentarily at a loss for the words he had rehearsed during the long journey from Ashwood territory. "Damien," she replied evenly, no trace of the raw anguish that had marked their previous exchange. "I did not expect to see you again so soon." "I needed to see for myself," he admitted, echoing what he had told Kane at the gate. "Whether what I have heard is true, whether you have truly found something real here, something worth the price both our packs might pay for it." Elena glanced briefly at Kane, something warm and unmistakable passing between them, before she turned her attention back to Damien. "I have found something real, yes, something I did not expect to find, especially not with him, given everything I once believed about his pack. But it is real, Damien, and I will not apologize for it." "I am not asking you to apologize," Damien said quickly. "I came here to release myself from whatever guilt and regret I have been carrying since that night. I needed to see that you were truly happy, that leaving with him was not simply an act of desperation in the moment, but something that has genuinely brought you peace." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for the sincerity behind his words, and found it there, mixed with a quiet sadness that suggested he had finally begun to accept the reality of everything that had unfolded since their wedding fell apart. "I am happy, Damien. Happier than I ever expected to be, given how our story ended." Something in Damien's shoulders relaxed slightly, a tension he had been carrying for weeks finally beginning to release. "Then I am glad, truly, even if it took me far too long to reach a place where I could say that honestly." Kane, who had remained quietly observant throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What happens now, Damien? Between our packs, I mean. I would prefer we find a way forward that does not reignite old conflicts neither of us can afford to sustain." Damien considered the question seriously, the weight of his responsibilities as alpha settling back over him after weeks of being consumed by personal turmoil. "I think it is time our packs found a genuine path toward peace, rather than the fragile truce we have maintained through mutual avoidance. Perhaps what happened between the three of us, painful as it was, could become the beginning of something better between Ashwood and Nightfall as a whole." Elena felt a swell of something like hope rise in her chest at the suggestion, an unexpected silver lining emerging from the wreckage of her broken engagement. "I would like that," she said. "I would like to see something good come from all of this, beyond simply my own happiness." They spoke for a while longer, the three of them, discussing the possibility of formal talks between the packs, the details of old boundary disputes that might finally be resolved through diplomacy, rather than continued tension. It was strange, Elena thought, standing there with the two men whose lives had become so unexpectedly intertwined with her own, feeling something like closure settling over a chapter of her life she had once believed would define her with only pain and humiliation. Before he departed, Damien turned to Elena one final time, his expression carrying a sincerity she had not seen from him since the earliest days of their relationship, long before the wedding, long before everything had grown complicated. "I hope you find every happiness you deserve, Elena. I am sorry it could not have been with me, but I am grateful, in the end, that you found it at all. Thank you, Damien, Elena said, and found that she meant the words without any bitterness lingering beneath them. I hope you find the same peace with Celine that I have found here. As Damien's figure disappeared down the mountain road, returning to the life and the mate that awaited him in Ashwood territory, Elena felt the last remaining weight of her old life finally lift from her shoulders entirely. Beside her, Kane reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, without hesitation. Standing together at the border between two territories that had spent generations locked in bitter rivalry, now perhaps standing at the threshold of something entirely new. The weeks that followed Damien's visit brought a flurry of activity to Nightfall territory, as Kane began the careful work of arranging formal peace talks with Ashwood leadership, a process that required navigating decades of accumulated grievances on both sides. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these discussions, her first-hand understanding of Ashwood customs and history proving unexpectedly valuable to negotiations that might otherwise have stumbled over simple misunderstandings. Not everyone within Nightfall territory welcomed these developments with open arms. A faction of older pack members, still carrying memories of past conflicts, viewed the prospect of peace with Ashwood as a betrayal of those who had been lost in previous border disputes. Nadia, despite her gradually warming relationship with Elena, found herself caught uncomfortably between her personal grief and her growing respect for the woman who had once represented everything she distrusted. "I need to speak with you," Nadia said one afternoon, finding Elena alone in the manor's garden, tending to a small collection of herbs she had begun cultivating in the weeks since her arrival. "Of course," Elena said, setting down her gardening tools and giving Nadia her full attention, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "I have watched you these past months," Nadia began, choosing her words carefully. "I expected to find reasons to distrust you further, evidence that you were simply using our alpha for protection, or worse, gathering information to carry back to your former pack. Instead, I have found someone who genuinely seems to care about building something real here, and about finding peace between our territories, rather than simply escaping one difficult situation for another." Elena listened quietly, recognizing the significance of what Nadia was offering, even before she finished speaking. "That means more to me than you might realize, Nadia. I know how difficult it has been for you, given everything your family lost in the conflicts between our packs. My brother believed peace was possible, before he died," Nadia said, her voice tightening slightly with old grief that had never fully healed. "He used to talk about a future where our children would not have to grow up hating their neighbors, simply because of old boundary lines, drawn generations before any of us were born. I stopped believing that future was possible after I lost him. But watching you, watching how genuinely you and Kane care for each other, and watching the careful work you have both put into these peace talks, I find myself daring to believe it again." Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion at the weight of Nadia's words, understanding fully what it must have cost her to voice such vulnerability after years of guarded hostility. "I would like to honor your brother's hope, if I can. I think finding real peace between Ashwood and Nightfall would mean something important, not just for our packs today, but for everyone who has been lost to conflicts that never should have escalated as far as they did." The conversation marked a genuine turning point in Elena's standing within the pack, word of Nadia's shifting acceptance spreading quickly among those who had previously held reservations about the Ashwood woman living among them. Slowly but steadily, the wary distance that had characterized Elena's early days in Nightfall territory began to soften into something closer to genuine belonging. The formal peace talks, when they finally convened, proved more complicated than either Kane or Damien had initially anticipated, old grievances surfacing repeatedly as elders from both packs struggled to set aside decades of accumulated distrust. Elena found herself serving as an unofficial bridge during particularly tense negotiations, her unique position, as someone who had lived within both territories, allowing her to translate concerns and misunderstandings that might otherwise have derailed the entire process. "You have a gift for this," Kane observed one evening, after a particularly difficult session had finally concluded with tentative progress on a long-standing boundary dispute, finding common ground where others only see conflict. "I have simply lived long enough within both worlds to understand that the people on the other side of an old grievance are rarely as different as the stories suggest," Elena said, settling beside him on the balcony, where they had taken to spending their evenings together, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Most of what divides Ashwood and Nightfall comes down to fear, passed down through generations, rather than any real, current threat. Kane reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past months. I am grateful every day that you chose to stay, Elena. Not just for what you have brought to these negotiations, though that has been invaluable. For everything you have brought to my life, and to this pack, simply by being here. Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling a contentment settle over her that she had once believed impossible to reclaim after the devastation of her broken wedding. I am grateful you offered me a place to land. That night, when everything I believed certain fell apart around me, I do not think I fully understood, standing on those steps in my wedding dress, that I was not losing everything. I was simply being redirected towards something far better than what I had planned for myself. As the peace talks continued to progress over the following weeks, gradually inching toward a formal agreement that would end generations of hostility between the two territories, Kane and Elena's own bond continued to deepen, strengthened by shared purpose and the slow, steady accumulation of trust that had grown between them since that first strange night. Word began to circulate, quietly at first and then more openly, of Kane's intention to formally claim Elena as his mate, and Luna, a ceremony that would mark not only their personal commitment to one another, but a powerful symbol of the new relationship blossoming between their two territories. News of Kane's intention to formally claim Elena as his Luna spread through Nightfall territory like wildfire, met largely with celebration by a pack that had watched their alpha transform over the past months, from a man burdened by isolation into someone visibly happier than they had seen him in years. But tradition within Nightfall demanded more than simple announcement, and an old law, rarely invoked in recent generations, required that any outsider seeking to become Luna first prove herself worthy before the full council of pack elders. I did not realize there would be a formal trial involved, Elena admitted to Kane one evening, nervousness creeping into her voice as the date for the council gathering approached. I assumed, given everything we have already built together, that this would be a simple matter of announcement. I am sorry, Kane said, genuine regret evident in his expression. I should have explained the tradition sooner. The council rarely invokes this requirement anymore, but given that you come from Ashwood territory, several of the older elders have insisted on following the old protocol precisely. What does the trial involve? Elena asked, steadying herself against the uncertainty of facing yet another gauntlet of judgment, though this one felt different somehow. Less like the humiliation she had faced at her broken wedding, and more like a genuine test she might actually be prepared to meet. You will stand before the full council and answer their questions honestly, Kane explained. They will ask about your intentions, your understanding of pack law and tradition, your commitment to Nightfall's well-being above any lingering loyalty to Ashwood. It is meant to ensure that any Luna joining our pack does so with full understanding and genuine commitment, rather than simply following the pull of a mate bond without deeper consideration. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what was being asked of her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she welcomed the opportunity to prove herself formally, rather than simply accepting her place through the strength of the bond alone. I am ready to face them, she said, and meant it. The council gathering took place several days later, in the great hall of the Nightfall Manor. Elders from across the territory gathered in solemn rows to witness the proceedings. Elena stood before them, dressed simply but with quiet dignity. Kane seated among the council, though tradition forbade him from speaking on her behalf during the formal questioning. The eldest among the council, a woman named Helena whose sharp eyes seemed to see straight through any pretense, opened the proceedings with a question that cut immediately to the heart of the matter. You come to us from Ashwood territory, a place our pack has fought against for generations. Why should we trust that your loyalty will genuinely shift to Nightfall, rather than remaining divided? Because Ashwood territory rejected me the night I was meant to become its Luna, Elena said, her voice steady despite the weight of every gaze fixed upon her. I have no lingering loyalty to a pack that humiliated me in front of 500 witnesses. What loyalty I carry now, I have built here, among people who welcomed me despite every reason they had to distrust me, and who have earned my genuine commitment through their own actions. Murmurs rippled through the assembled elders, several exchanging glances that suggested Elena's directness had made an impression. Another elder, an older man with a weathered face, spoke next. Peace talks are underway between our territories. Some among us worry that your presence here has less to do with genuine devotion to Nightfall and more to do with political convenience, a bridge our Alpha hopes to build using your connections to Ashwood. Elena considered this question carefully before answering, unwilling to dismiss the genuine concern underlying it. I understand why that concern exists, and I will not pretend my knowledge of Ashwood customs has not proven useful during these negotiations. But my commitment to Kane, and to this pack, exists entirely separate from any political usefulness I might offer. I would choose this life, choose him, choose all of you, even if peace between our territories proved impossible to achieve. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, the elders probing every aspect of Elena's understanding, her intentions, her commitment to the responsibilities that would come with becoming Luna. Nadia, seated among the council as a representative of the younger pack members, watched the proceedings with an expression that had shifted entirely from the guarded hostility she had shown during Elena's first days in the territory. Finally, Helena rose from her seat, addressing the full assembly with the authority of decades spent leading the council through difficult decisions. I have listened carefully to everything spoken here today, and I find myself satisfied that Elena Voss approaches this commitment with genuine understanding and sincere dedication, rather than simple convenience or the unchecked pull of a mate bond alone. I move that the council formally approve her claiming as Luna of Nightfall. A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled elders, far more unanimous than Elena had dared to hope for, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as the weight of acceptance settled over her, so different from the rejection she had faced at her broken wedding months before. Kane crossed the hall to stand beside her, pride evident in every line of his expression, and the assembled council rose together in a gesture of formal recognition that marked the true beginning of Elena's new life within Nightfall territory. You did that entirely on your own, Kane said quietly, once the formal proceedings had concluded, and the hall had begun to empty of elders offering their congratulations. I am so proud of you, Elena, not just for what you accomplished today, but for everything you have overcome to arrive at this moment. I could not have gotten here without you, Elena said, though she recognized the truth in his words as well, the genuine strength she had rediscovered within herself over the months since her wedding had fallen apart. But I think, perhaps for the first time in my life, I finally understand what it means to build something entirely, because I chose it, rather than simply accepting whatever path was laid out before me. With the council's formal approval secured, preparations began immediately for the ceremony that would mark Elena's official claiming as Luna of Nightfall, a celebration that would bring together not only the Nightfall pack, but representatives from Ashwood territory as well, a powerful symbol of the peace both packs had worked so hard to build in the months since that fateful broken wedding. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, sunlight spilling across Nightfall territory, in a way that felt almost deliberate after the gray mist that had shrouded the mountains for much of the preceding weeks. Elena stood in her chambers, dressed not in the elaborate white gown she had once worn to a wedding that ended in humiliation, but in a deep blue dress that Margaret had helped her choose, simple and elegant, a color that reflected the territory that had become her true home. You look radiant, Margaret said, adjusting a final detail in Elena's hair with the careful attention of someone who had come to genuinely care for the woman she was helping prepare. Nothing like the frightened, heartbroken woman who arrived here all those months ago. I feel radiant, Elena admitted, studying her reflection with a sense of wonder that still occasionally caught her off guard. I never imagined, standing on those altar steps in Ashwood territory, that I would find my way to a moment like this. Sometimes the paths we least expect lead us exactly where we belong, Margaret said, and Elena found she could not have described the sentiment more perfectly herself. The ceremony took place in the Great Hall, transformed for the occasion with garlands of mountain flowers and warm lanterns that cast a golden glow throughout the space, so different from the harsh chandelier light that had illuminated her failed wedding months before. Guests filled the hall, Nightfall pack members standing alongside a delegation from Ashwood territory that included, to Elena's genuine surprise and quiet gratitude, both Damien and Celine, who had traveled to witness the culmination of a story that had begun so painfully within their own territory. As Elena walked down the aisle, she felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her during her first wedding attempt, only a steady, growing joy that seemed to expand with every step, bringing her closer to Kane, who stood waiting at the front of the hall with an expression of open, unguarded happiness that mirrored her own. Helena, the council elder who had presided over Elena's formal questioning weeks before, stood ready to officiate the ceremony, her sharp eyes now softened with genuine warmth as she watched Elena approach. "We gather today," she began, once Elena had reached the front of the hall and taken Kane's outstretched hand, "not simply to witness the joining of two individuals, but to celebrate the beginning of a new chapter for both our territories, one built on genuine partnership rather than old grievances." The ceremony proceeded with a simplicity that felt entirely appropriate given everything Elena and Kane had built together. Vows exchanged not with grand declarations, but with quiet, sincere promises that carried far more weight than elaborate words ever could have. When Kane spoke his vows, his voice carried a steadiness that had nothing to do with practiced formality, and everything to do with genuine certainty. "I promise to stand beside you," he said, "not because a bond compelled me to, but because every day since you arrived in my territory, I have chosen you freely, and I will continue choosing you for as long as I am given the privilege of doing so." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she spoke her own vows in return, thinking of the broken woman who had walked away from an altar months before, never imagining she would find herself standing at another one, this time surrounded by genuine love rather than public humiliation. "I promise to build this life alongside you," she said, carrying forward not the pain of what I lost, but the strength I found in rebuilding something better than I ever imagined possible. When Helena finally pronounced them bonded before the full assembly, the great hall erupted in genuine celebration, applause and cheers rising from both Nightfall and Ashwood guests alike, a powerful symbol of the reconciliation that had grown from such an unlikely beginning. Elena caught sight of Damien across the hall, applauding along with everyone else, his expression carrying genuine happiness rather than any lingering trace of the possessive jealousy that had once consumed him. Later, during the celebration that followed, Damien approached Elena and Kane, offering his sincere congratulations. "I am grateful I finally learned to release the guilt I carried," he said, "and grateful that watching you both find each other taught me something important about the difference between the bonds fate assigns us and the love we choose to build deliberately, day after day." "Thank you for coming, Damien," Elena said, genuine warmth in her voice. "It means more than you know, having you here to witness this." As the celebration continued late into the evening, Elena found herself standing on the same balcony where she and Kane had first acknowledged the bond growing between them, watching the stars emerge over the mountains that had once represented enemy territory and now simply represented home. Kane joined her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and together they looked out over the territory that belonged to both of them now, united rather than divided by the history that had once separated their families. "Do you have any regrets?" Kane asked quietly, resting his chin against the top of her head. "About how everything unfolded? About the path that brought you here?" Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over every difficult step of the journey that had led her from a devastating humiliation to this moment of genuine, hard-won happiness. "None," she said finally, turning in his arms to face him directly. "Every painful step led me exactly where I was meant to be. I would not trade this life, this love, this home, for anything I lost that night." Below them, the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and music drifting up from the great hall, where Nightfall and Ashwood wolves mingled together in genuine peace, for the first time in generations. Elena thought of the broken bride who had once fled a wedding hall in humiliation, and felt only gratitude for the winding, unexpected path that had transformed that devastating night into the foundation for everything she had built since. She had lost a wedding, but she had found a life. She had lost a man who chose another woman before her eyes, but she had found a partner who chose her freely, deliberately, every single day since. And as she stood there beneath the stars, wrapped in the arms of the man who had once been called her enemy, Elena Voss understood, finally and completely, that sometimes the most devastating endings simply clear the way for the beginnings we were always meant to find.